Time to pull up a chair. We've got another great story for you today in the rLounge. This is the story of a dying man, a devoted child, and one woman who tried so hard to stage manage everyone's grief that she accidentally directed her own downfall. Today in the rLounge, the widow who started shopping for a new life before the body was cold and learned the will had other plans. Stepmother, who always hated me, tried to keep me from Dad's funeral and will reading. Now she's begging for mercy as I own the house and she's about to be homeless. I got a call from my dad that changed everything. He told me he had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. His voice was weak, but he tried to sound upbeat about it, saying they'd caught it and were going to try some treatments. I knew better though. Pancreatic cancer at stage 4 is basically a death sentence. When I tried calling back later that day, I asked more questions. My stepmother answered. She didn't even bother putting him on speaker when I asked to talk to him. Just said he was resting and couldn't be disturbed. Classic Diane, not a real name. She's been like this since she married my dad 8 years ago, always trying to control his time and who he talks to, especially me. I drove to the hospital as soon as I could. When I got there, Diane was sitting next to his bed like some kind of gatekeeper. The moment she saw me, her face did that thing where she tries to smile, but it looks more like she's constipated. She immediately told me that my father only needed his rest, and that doctors had supposedly limited visitors to 15 minutes max. Dad immediately perked up when he saw me and reached for my hand. He insisted I stay, completely contradicting what Diane had just said. I could practically feel her glaring at the back of my head as I sat down. Dad and I talked for about an hour. He filled me in on the treatment plan, though I could tell from his eyes he knew it was a long shot. Diane kept interrupting, reminding us about the 15-minute rule she'd made up, checking her watch, sighing loudly. Dad finally told her to go get some coffee so we could talk. After she left, he squeezed my hand and apologized for her behavior, claiming she meant well, but I knew better. She never was meant well, but I wasn't going to argue with my dying father. A couple weeks later, I visited again. Dad looked worse, but his spirits were better. The nurse told me he'd been asking when I was coming. Diane wasn't there when I arrived, but showed up about 20 minutes into my visit. She immediately started fidgeting and checking the time. When she stepped out to talk to a nurse, Dad leaned in close and told me he'd updated his will recently. He wanted me to know. Before he could say anything else, Diane walked back in and gave me that death stare she's perfected over the years. I changed the subject, but not before noticing how suddenly she seemed very interested in our conversation. Later that week, I stopped by their house to drop off some of Dad's favorite books. Diane answered the door in designer clothes, which seemed odd considering her husband was dying in the hospital. The house looked different too. New furniture in the living room, fancy art on the walls. She was redecorating while he was fighting for his life. She tried to take the books at the door, claiming she'd made sure he'd get them. When I insisted on bringing them myself, she reluctantly let me in but claimed he was too tired for visitors today. I put my foot down and said I'd be quick. She gave me a look that could curdle milk, but let me in. The house was definitely getting a makeover. There were paint samples on the wall and catalogs for expensive furniture on the coffee table. She was already planning her new life without him. At the hospital, Dad was definitely not too tired for visitors. In fact, he lit up when I walked in. Diane hovered the entire time, interrupting whenever we started talking about anything important. When I mentioned the redecorating, she quickly changed the subject. Things got worse fast after that. Dad's condition deteriorated rapidly. One day I showed up at the hospital and Diane tried to physically block me from entering his room, insisting he was too tired for visitors today. I told her I wasn't a visitor. I was his child and pushed past her. I found Dad looking gaunt but alert. The relief on his face when he saw me was heartbreaking. He reached for my hand and held it the entire visit while Diane stood in the corner texting someone, occasionally glaring at us. A few days later, my phone rang. It was Dad, but not from the house phone, from his cell. He told me they were moving him to hospice and that Diane was supposed to tell me, but she claimed she forgot. I asked when, and he said tomorrow morning. He asked if I could come see him before then, and I told him I was on my way. When I got there, Diane was nowhere to be found. Dad seemed almost relieved she wasn't there. He looked terrible, but his mind was clear. He expressed worry about what would happen after he was gone and made me promise to talk to Greg after he passed. Greg was his best friend since college and also happened to be his attorney. Dad then quietly told me that Diane wasn't who he thought she was and that he'd made arrangements. Before he could say more, a nurse came in to check his vitals and the moment was gone. Dad was moved to hospice the next day. I visited every day, sometimes finding Diane there, sometimes not. When she was there, she made sure we were never alone together. When she wasn't, Dad would try to tell me things, but he was on so much medication by then that he often drifted off mid-sentence. Then came the text I'd been dreading but expecting. It wasn't from Diane, but from Greg. "Your father passed this morning. Diane said she tried to reach you but couldn't." I checked my phone. No missed calls from her. Not even a text. Just nothing. I called her. I asked why she didn't tell me Dad died, and she claimed she tried calling but I didn't answer. A complete lie. She said they were planning a small service with just family. When I pointed out that I am family, she said she meant immediate family, meaning just her as his wife. She claimed it's what he would have wanted, which was complete bull. When I asked for the funeral details, she said she'd let me know when they were finalized and hung up. The next day I got a group text about the funeral. It was scheduled for 2 days later and specified immediate family only due to limited space. I noticed that she included her sister, her 2 adult children from her previous marriage, and even her niece in the group chat. So much for immediate family only. I called Greg, who seemed surprised I hadn't been more involved in the arrangements. He told me that Dad was very clear about wanting me at his funeral and had left specific instructions about it. When I explained that Diane was claiming it was family only and implying I didn't count, Greg advised me to show up anyway. He said he'd be there along with several of Dad's old friends, and that she couldn't keep me out without making a scene. I arrived at the funeral home early, but not early enough. When I tried to enter, there was a security guard at the door who actually had a photo of me and instructions not to let me in. He apologized but said the family had requested I not attend. I told him I was the family and that was my father in there, but he insisted he was just doing his job. I was not about to miss my own father's funeral because of this woman. I started yelling, demanding to be let in. People started coming out to see what the commotion was about. Several of Dad's old college friends recognized me and intervened, telling the security guard I was Harold's daughter and that if I wasn't allowed in, none of them were getting in either. The guard looked uncomfortable and radioed someone. A minute later, Diane appeared, wearing an expensive black dress and looking furious. She hissed at me that I was making a scene, and I shot back loud enough for everyone to hear that she was keeping me from my father's funeral. People were staring now. She knew she wouldn't win this one without looking like the villain she is, so she told me I could come in, but I had to sit in the back and not make a spectacle of myself. I ignored her and sat in the front row. The look on her face was almost worth all the pain. The next morning, I woke up to a text from her saying I'd ruined my father's funeral with my selfishness and should be ashamed for myself. She added that she'd be taking care of my father's affairs and would let me know if there was anything for me. I didn't bother responding. I knew Greg would handle the will and whatever else needed to be done. Sure enough, a few days later, Greg called to tell me that the will reading was scheduled. He explained that Diane had tried to have it done privately without me, but he'd explained that wasn't legal or ethical. He told me to be at his office at 2 p.m. on Monday. When I arrived at Greg's office, Diane was already there, dressed like she was going to a fashion show instead of a will reading. She barely acknowledged me, just gave a little sniff when I sat across from her. Greg started reading the will, and I watched Diane's face as it slowly dawned on her that things weren't going her way. Dad had left me the house, his savings, and most of his valuable possessions. Diane received only what she had brought into the marriage, plus a small monthly stipend for 1 year to get back on her feet. She started sputtering before Greg even finished reading, claiming this couldn't be right, that Harold had promised her everything including the house. She insisted it must be an old will. Greg showed her the date on the document and explained it was executed 3 months ago, and that Harold was of sound mind when he signed it, with statements from his doctors to that effect. She turned to me, her face contorted with rage, accusing me of poisoning him against her. Greg interjected that Harold had made these decisions entirely on his own and was quite clear about his wishes. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard a picture fell off the wall. The day after that, I opened the door to find her standing there, looking like she hadn't slept. For the next 20 minutes, she cycled between crying and screaming at me. 1 minute she was sobbing about how much she loved my father and how she'd taken such good care of him. The next, she was threatening to contest the will and make my life hell. She claimed Dad wasn't in his right mind when he updated the will, that I had manipulated him while he was weak and vulnerable. I recorded the entire meltdown on my phone without her knowledge. Eventually, I told her to leave. 3 days later, I received a formal notice from Greg that all assets had been transferred to my name. The house deed now listed me as sole owner. I sent Diane official notice giving her 60 days to vacate the house as required by law. A few days after that, her adult son messaged me. He had the nerve to call me heartless for putting his mother on the street. I sent him screenshots of her texts to me over the years, including ones where she complained about having to deal with my dad's baggage, meaning me. I also sent him the recording of her meltdown at my apartment. I'm not sure what happens next. Part of me feels bad about the situation, but a bigger part remembers how she treated my dad in his final days, how she tried to keep me from his funeral, and how she was already redecorating the house while he was dying in the hospital. Dad knew exactly what he was doing with his will. He saw through her in the end and made sure she couldn't take what was meant for me. Update. So I decided to drive by my house now legally, to check on things since I hadn't heard from Diane in a few days. As I pulled up, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were people walking in and out carrying furniture, artwork, and boxes. Diane was having what looked like an estate sale, selling items that legally belonged to me. I parked across the street and watched for a bit, taking photos and videos with my phone. I was furious, but kept my cool enough to document everything. I sent the photos to Greg, Dad's attorney, immediately. He called me within minutes, sounding as angry as I've ever heard him. He told me to stay put and that he'd handle it. Within 2 hours, he'd gotten an emergency court order to stop the unauthorized sale of my property and was on his way with a sheriff to enforce it. I stayed in my car until they arrived. The look on Diane's face when the sheriff walked up and handed her the court order was priceless. She tried playing innocent at first, claiming she was just organizing things before moving out. The sheriff wasn't buying it and informed her that she was not authorized to sell any items from the estate. By this point, a small crowd of neighbors and potential buyers had gathered to watch. Diane completely lost it, started screaming that it was her house and her property, that I was a manipulative brat who had tricked my dying father into changing his will. The sheriff had to physically step between us when she started moving toward me. One of the neighbors was recording the whole thing on their phone. I found out later that it had been shared in the neighborhood group chat. The sheriff made everyone leave and had Diane provide a list of what had already been sold. He informed her that she could face criminal charges for selling property that wasn't hers. She was forced to call people who had already purchased items and tell them to return them. I've never seen someone so humiliated and angry at the same time. A few days later, Diane's tone suddenly changed. I received a tearful voicemail from her begging for more time in the house. She claimed she had nowhere to go and no money saved, that her friends couldn't take her in and her family was unable to help. She said she'd been a good wife to my father and didn't deserve to be thrown out on the street. I didn't respond. The 60-day notice was already more than generous considering what she'd done. The eviction date finally arrived. I showed up with Greg and a sheriff's deputy, expecting her to have moved out as legally required. Instead, we found she had barricaded herself in the master bedroom. The sheriff had to talk through the door for almost 20 minutes before she would come out. When she finally emerged, she was still in her pajamas, claiming she had nowhere to go, and that I was just like my mother, and this is why Dad never loved me. The sheriff explained she had no choice. She had to leave now. She was allowed to take only her personal belongings, which she hadn't even packed. She spent the next 2 hours throwing clothes into suitcases while muttering about how unfair everything was. She was escorted out by the sheriff, and just like that, it was over. Your dad spent his final months fighting cancer, and Diane spent hers fighting you. Your father's intentions were crystal clear. He wanted you involved, he wanted you there, and he trusted you enough to update his will to protect what mattered to him. Diane's behavior isn't just overbearing or controlling, it's cruel. She kept you from precious time with your dying father, lied about his condition, lied about contacting you, tried to keep you from his funeral, and then immediately started redecorating like she was prepping for a real estate listing. The estate sale alone tells you everything you need to know about what her priorities were. You didn't take anything from her. She got exactly what she was entitled to, which happened to be the only what she brought into the marriage. You don't owe her compassion, forgiveness, or extra time in the house. The only person you owed anything to was your dad, and you showed up for him every step of the way while she tried to push you out. What do you think? Thank you for joining us today in the rLounge. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video. Until next time. And please put your chair back where you found it.